The shelter was eerily quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that made the ticking of the clock seem louder than it should be. Yet, through the stillness, there was a sound. A faint whimper. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but soon enough, it grew louder, more desperate. The cry echoed through the cold concrete walls, a sound that should have pulled anyone's attention. Inside the shelter, a few workers went about their usual tasks. One of them, a seasoned worker named Ali, was busy sorting through paperwork. He had been working at the shelter for years, long enough to know the routine. Feeding time, cleaning, and, of course, dealing with the constant flow of new animals, most of which had already been given up by their owners, abandoned without a second thought. The crying continued. But Ali didn't react. He had heard it before. Every day, it seemed like one dog or another would start whining, howling, or crying out of boredom, loneliness, or hunger. After a while, you become numb to it. He just hoped it wasn't one of the more difficult dogs. The ones who never stopped barking or whining no matter what. Still, the sound pierced through him, tugging at something deep inside, but he pushed it away. It wasn't his problem. Just another day, Ali muttered to himself, tapping the pencil against the desk. A few moments later, a fellow worker, Lara, passed by, looking annoyed. That dog's been at it for hours. Someone should check on it. Ali glanced up, a brief flicker of concern crossing his face, but then it vanished as quickly as it came. I'm sure it's fine. It'll stop eventually. The noise didn't stop, though. It wasn't just a whimper anymore, it was a pitiful cry, like something was deeply wrong. Yet, the workers continued with their tasks. Lara shook her head and walked away, deciding not to bother with it either. The dog continued its cries, but still, no one went to investigate. Ali distracted himself with another task, trying to ignore the sound, even though it tugged at his heart. Maybe the dog just needed attention, maybe it was hungry, maybe it was scared, whatever it was, someone else would deal with it. After all, there were so many others here, and this wasn't the first time this kind of thing had happened. Another day, another dog, another problem to ignore. Hours passed, and the cry still lingered in the background. By now, most of the shelter had settled into the evening routine. The workers were tired, the lights were dimming, and the shelter had that quiet, almost empty feeling. But that cry, it was constant. It seemed to fill the entire building, a reminder that something was wrong. Finally, the sound grew softer, as if the dog had worn itself out, or worse, was too weak to cry any longer. But in the silence that followed, it became clear, something wasn't right. It wasn't just any ordinary cry. It was the sound of a dog in distress, one that needed help, one that had been crying out for far too long. But the workers, Ali, Lara, and the others, remained unaware. The cry had become just another noise in the background. No one noticed it anymore. No one cared. At least, not yet. And as the night fell deeper, the dog's desperate call slowly faded into nothingness, leaving behind a silence that spoke more than any sound ever could. It had been another long day at the shelter, but for some reason, today felt different. Ali couldn't shake the nagging feeling he'd had since he'd left work the day before. The crying dog sound still echoed in his mind. He couldn't tell if it was the guilt, the nagging curiosity, or something else that was bothering him. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew something was off. Today, the shelter was getting a visit from a new vet. Her name was Dr. Isabella, a recent graduate who had joined the team to help with the growing number of animals needing care. She was known for her sharp eye and compassionate heart, and everyone had been eager to see how she would approach the shelter's chaotic environment. The morning started as usual, with workers going about their tasks, feeding, cleaning, and managing the intake of new animals. The cries of the ignored dog were still faint in the background, but Ali wasn't paying much attention to it anymore. He had pushed it out of his mind. Dr. Isabella arrived around noon, her presence a breath of fresh air amid the stale shelter air. She smiled as she greeted the workers, but there was an intensity in her gaze as she scanned the room. She wasn't just here to do her job, she was here to make a difference. Ollie had heard about Dr. Isabella's reputation, but he hadn't expected her to immediately focus on the dog that had been crying for weeks. "Who's in charge of this one?" Dr. Isabella asked, her voice calm but firm, as she gestured toward the kennel where the dog had been kept. Ollie glanced over. It was the same dog, the one no one had paid much attention to. The small, scruffy brown dog with the haunting eyes. It had been locked away in a corner for days, barely moving except for the occasional pitiful cry. The workers had grown used to the sound, ignoring it as if it were just part of the background noise of the shelter. "That's just another one of the dogs that, well, you know," Ollie replied, avoiding Dr. Isabella's gaze. "It's been crying a lot lately. Probably just needs some attention." Dr. Isabella raised an eyebrow. She didn't seem convinced. "I don't think that's it," she said softly, moving toward the kennel. Her steps were slow, measured, as if she was walking toward something important. Something that needed her full attention. She knelt down to the dog's level, her gloved hands gently lifting its head to get a closer look. The dog, who had been too weak to lift its head earlier, now seemed to acknowledge her presence. It stared at her with big, brown eyes, filled with fear, confusion, and something else, a silent plea for help. Ollie watched from a distance, feeling a twinge of discomfort. He had seen this dog cry for weeks, and while it had been annoying at times, he hadn't expected anyone to take such an interest in it. But Dr. Isabella didn't just see a dog in pain, she saw something far more serious. "Something's not right here," she muttered to herself, her brow furrowing. She gently pressed the dog's side, and it yelped, flinching as if the touch had caused it great pain. Ollie's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen the dog react like that before. "What's wrong with it?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Dr. Isabella's eyes narrowed. She looked up at him, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. "It's in pain," she said, her tone serious. "This dog is suffering, Ollie. You didn't hear it, but it's not just crying for attention. There's something deeply wrong. Something physical." Ollie felt a lump rise in his throat. He had known something was wrong, but he had dismissed it, assuming it was just an ordinary case of neglect or a dog being overdramatic. He had no idea it was this serious. Dr. Isabella stood up, glancing around the shelter with a sense of urgency. "We need to get this dog checked immediately. It's critical," she said, her voice firm. She motioned for Ollie to help her as they carefully removed the dog from the kennel and placed it on a gurney. Ollie felt a pang of guilt settle in his stomach. He hadn't done enough. No one had. The dog's cries were softer now, barely a whisper, but they were still there, a reminder of the suffering it had endured. As Dr. Isabella prepared to examine the dog, Ollie couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. He had heard the cries, but had failed to act. And now, there was no turning back. The truth was out there now, and Dr. Isabella was determined to uncover it. Whatever was happening to this poor dog, it was far more than Ollie had ever imagined. The shelter was quiet as Dr. Isabella carefully examined the small, scruffy dog. It's hard to tell without an X-ray or more detailed scans, but whatever caused this, it's been causing this dog immense pain. And it's been crying out for help this whole time. The reason no one could figure out what was wrong is because the symptoms were subtle at first. But the longer it goes untreated, the worse it gets. Ollie's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The dog's cries hadn't been from hunger or fear, they were cries of pure agony, a desperate plea for help. And he, along with the others, had ignored it. His gut twisted with guilt. How could we have missed this? Ollie whispered, his voice laced with shame. He had seen the dog suffer for weeks, heard the cries, but he had dismissed them as just another nuisance. How could he have been so blind? Dr. Isabella didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gently moved the dog onto its side, her fingers working quickly to feel along its spine and abdomen. The dog let out a soft groan, but didn't fight her touch. There was no energy left to resist. It had given up, its small body broken from weeks of neglect. "We need to get this dog into surgery right away," Dr. Isabella said firmly, looking back at Ollie. "It's a matter of life or death at this point. The longer we wait, the less chance it has." Ollie nodded, his mind racing. Surgery. The word itself seemed so final, so serious. He had never thought it would come to this. The dog had been just another shelter animal, another face in the crowd, but now, it was a living, breathing being that needed him. Needed them. He swallowed hard and looked at the dog, who was now resting, its eyes fluttering closed, clearly exhausted. The guilt weighed heavily on Ali's shoulders, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for regret now. They had to act fast. He turned to Dr. Isabella. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes." She nodded, already moving to prepare the necessary tools for the surgery. Ollie helped her lift the dog onto a stretcher, trying his best not to jostle it too much. It was an odd feeling, this small creature, so fragile and broken, now depended on him, on them, for a chance at survival. He was the one who had ignored it for weeks, but now, he would be the one to help save it. As they wheeled the dog to the surgery room, Ollie couldn't help but glance down at its weary face. It was hard to believe how much pain it had been through. How much it had suffered, all while no one seemed to care. He had been part of that, a small but significant piece of its suffering. And now, it was up to him, and Dr. Isabella, to do whatever they could to make it right. Ollie stood outside the operating room, pacing nervously. He could hear the faint sounds of Dr. Isabella working inside, her steady voice giving instructions, the quiet hum of the medical equipment, and the occasional rustle of cloth as she moved around. Every minute felt like an hour. Every moment spent waiting felt heavier than the last. He kept replaying the events in his mind, each one playing out like a cruel reminder of his failure. The sound of the dog crying had been impossible to ignore, yet he had. The tears, the desperate whimpers, he had heard them, but it had been easier to pretend that they were just part of the background noise of the shelter. After all, there were always other animals to care for, always another task to do. Why focus on just one when so many others needed attention? But now, with the dog fighting for its life in the operating room, the weight of his inaction pressed down on him. He could feel it in every inch of his body, the guilt gnawing at him relentlessly. He had ignored the signs. He had dismissed the cries. He thought about the other workers. Lara, who had passed by the dog every day without a second thought. How many times had she seen the dog crying and shrugged it off? They were all complicit in this failure. They had all been too caught up in the routine of their work, too blinded by the constant stream of animals coming through the shelter doors, to notice the one who was silently suffering. Ollie stopped pacing and pressed his hands to the cool metal wall. His mind kept going back to that one moment, when he had first heard the dog cry. He could have gone over. He could have checked to see if something was wrong. But he hadn't. It had seemed insignificant, just another sad animal. Now, here he was, waiting, hoping, praying that it wasn't too late. But a part of him already knew, it wasn't just about the dog anymore. This wasn't just a medical emergency. This was a lesson he would never forget. A lesson about compassion, about responsibility, and about the consequences of not acting when something, or someone, needed help. It wasn't just the dog who had been abandoned. It was him too. He had abandoned his duty to care, to truly notice, to go beyond the surface and see the deeper needs of the animals in his care. His failure to recognize that had brought them all to this point. The door to the operating room opened suddenly, and Dr. Isabella stepped out. Her face was calm, but there was a hardness in her eyes, something that Ollie could not read. She didn't speak right away, but the silence between them felt as loud as the dog's cries had once been. Finally, Dr. Isabella spoke, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of the situation. "The surgery was complicated, but I think we'll be okay. We managed to stabilize it." Ollie exhaled in relief, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He had wanted this outcome so badly, yet part of him still felt uneasy, knowing that the dog's life had come so close to slipping away. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. He couldn't find the words to explain the depth of his gratitude, but he hoped Dr. Isabella understood. She had saved the dog, but she had also shown him something that no one else had, what it meant to truly care, to notice, and to act when it mattered most. Dr. Isabella nodded but didn't offer any reassurances. "You did your part, Ollie. You called me. You got the dog here in time." She paused before continuing, her gaze softer now. "But you're right. There's more to it than that. It's easy to overlook things when you're surrounded by so much. We all fall into that trap sometimes. But this time, we caught it before it was too late." Ollie lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen the signs before, he had heard the cries. Yet, he had chosen to ignore them. His actions, or lack thereof, could have cost the dog its life. And even now, as the dog lay in recovery, Ollie knew that he couldn't change the past. But he could change how he acted from here on out. He could make a promise to never turn a blind eye again. Not to an animal, not to anyone who needed help. "I'm sorry," Ollie said, his voice breaking. The words felt inadequate, but they were the only ones that seemed to matter right now. Dr. Isabella gave him a small, understanding smile. "We all make mistakes, Ollie. What matters is what we learn from them." As Ollie turned to walk back toward the shelter's main room, he felt the weight of his regret begin to lift, just a little. The dog had survived. It was alive, and it had a chance. But Ollie's real work had only just begun. He needed to prove to himself, to the animals in the shelter, and to everyone around him that he could be the person they needed. That he would be the person who would never ignore a cry for help again. The days after the surgery felt like a blur to Ollie. The weight of the previous weeks, the guilt, and the uncertainty, was starting to lift ever so slightly, replaced by a new sense of purpose. Every time he visited the recovery room to check on the small dog, he felt a spark of hope, as if the dog was slowly teaching him how to be better. The dog was much weaker than he'd expected, but every day, there was a small improvement. Its eyes, once clouded with pain and fear, had softened, and its body no longer trembled from the internal wounds that had nearly cost it its life. The whimpering had stopped, replaced by quiet breathing, and although it couldn't walk yet, it had started to move its head when Ollie came near. Ollie stood by the dog's side one morning, carefully cleaning the area around its recovery bed. He spoke to it softly, almost as if reassuring himself. "You're going to be all right," he said quietly, brushing a strand of fur from the dog's face. "We've got you now." The dog looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, as if understanding his words. Its gaze was no longer distant, no longer afraid. The bond between them, though still fragile, was growing. And Ollie could feel it, deep in his chest. It was like a shift, slow, steady, and full of promise. This wasn't just about saving the dog's life anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, about doing things right this time. Dr. Isabella had said the recovery process would take time. It was going to be slow and steady, but there was hope. The damage had been extensive, but not irreversible. Every day the dog regained strength was a small victory. As Ollie helped clean the dog's fur, he reflected on what he had learned. He hadn't just saved an animal's life, he had also saved a part of himself. The shelter worker who had ignored the cries, the man who had thought that one animal's suffering didn't matter, was slowly disappearing. In his place, a more attentive, compassionate person was emerging. But the recovery wasn't easy. The dog had its moments of doubt. There were days when it looked like it wouldn't make it, times when it seemed to lose the will to fight. Ollie could see the moments when the dog was uncertain, when it hesitated to take the next step, to trust again. It wasn't just the physical healing that the dog needed, it was emotional healing too. The trauma of the weeks spent in agony, unheard and ignored, was something that could not be easily forgotten. The dog's body was fragile, yes, but its heart was fragile too. One morning, as Ollie sat by the dog's side, watching it take tentative steps toward the small bowl of water, he saw something that made his heart swell. The dog, though shaky, was trying. Trying to move, trying to eat, trying to live. It was a small step, but a huge one. Ollie couldn't help but smile, a sense of pride and affection welling up inside him. The dog had been through so much, and now, it was beginning to heal, to fight for a second chance at life. He stayed by its side every day, providing the comfort and support the dog needed. The workers in the shelter slowly began to notice the change in the dog, and even in Ollie. There was a new respect in their eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated the depth of what had happened here. The dog wasn't just another case to be dealt with, it was a survivor, just like them. And slowly, bit by bit, the dog started to walk again, its legs trembling as it moved around the room. Ollie watched, his heart full of both joy and sorrow. It was a reminder that recovery wasn't just physical. The dog was learning to trust again. To take those first steps, not only back to health but also back to the life it had been denied for so long. The weeks passed, and the dog grew stronger. Its fur began to shine again, its eyes sparkled with life, and its once broken spirit began to heal. It had fought so hard to survive, and now, it was finding its way back to what it had lost. For Ollie, this transformation wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about him, too. The worker who had once ignored the suffering of an animal, the one who had been blind to the cries of distress, had changed. He had learned what it meant to truly see. To care. To act when action was needed. And now, he had a responsibility to every animal that came through the shelter doors, to listen, to act, and to never turn away. The dog's recovery was a reminder of all of that, of the power of second chances, of healing, and of redemption. And as Ollie looked at the dog, standing strong on its own 2 feet, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had played a role in this. He had helped give the dog a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, the dog had given him one too. As the weeks passed, Ollie began to see the changes in the small dog with a growing sense of wonder. It wasn't just the dog's body that was healing, it was its spirit. The hesitation in its movements was slowly replaced with cautious curiosity. It began to explore the room, taking its first hesitant steps, the once scared eyes now filled with cautious hope. Ollie found himself watching the dog every chance he got. There was something about its journey that mirrored his own. He had been distant, cold, and indifferent for so long, but now, seeing this dog fight for its life, for a second chance, he was beginning to understand the true meaning of compassion. The bond between them grew stronger each day. The dog had started to follow Ollie around the room, and though it couldn't walk far yet, it seemed to sense when Ollie was nearby. Its tail, which had once been tucked between its legs in fear, now wagged cautiously when Ollie would approach. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, feeding, and caring for the animals, Ollie sat down beside the dog's bed. It was a quiet moment, the kind that made everything else fade into the background. For the first time in weeks, Ollie didn't feel the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. He just sat there, watching the dog slowly but steadily make its way over to him. The dog's steps were still a bit shaky, but it had a determination in its eyes, one that Ollie had come to admire. When it reached Ollie's side, it lay down, resting its head against his leg. It was an unexpected act of trust, one that Ollie had never expected to come so soon. He gently reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears. The dog closed its eyes, enjoying the gentle touch, and for a moment, Ollie allowed himself to smile. This was a victory. It wasn't about the surgery or the medical care anymore, it was about this connection. About the dog's ability to trust again, despite everything it had been through. Ollie's fingers moved slowly through the dog's fur, and as he did, he realized how far they had both come. The dog had fought to survive the physical pain, and now, it was learning to trust again. But in that same moment, Ollie felt a shift in himself. He had spent so many years working at the shelter, treating the animals as nothing more than tasks to be completed. But this dog had shown him something he had never fully understood before, how important it was to truly connect, to give all of yourself to the beings you cared for. As the dog settled more comfortably, Ollie leaned back, his thoughts quieting. The dog was now healing, and for the first time, Ollie felt as though he was, too. He had been so wrapped up in his guilt and the mistakes he had made, but now, sitting here with the dog, he understood that healing didn't happen in an instant. It took time, trust, and a willingness to open up. The dog had shown him that, and as they sat together in the fading light of the room, Ollie felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. But there was more to this bond than just a sense of calm. There was a deep emotional connection forming, one that neither of them could have predicted. Ollie wasn't just the shelter worker anymore, he was the dog's protector, its friend, and in some ways, it was starting to feel like the dog was his protector too. In the quiet moments, when no one else was around, they shared a connection that was born out of understanding, healing, and second chances. Days passed, and each time Ollie looked at the dog, the bond between them deepened. It was no longer just about caring for an animal. It was about saving a life. Not just the dog's life, but his own. The lessons he had learned through this experience were far more profound than he could have ever imagined. This was more than just redemption, it was a transformation. And as the dog's recovery progressed, Ollie knew that he had become part of its story, just as it had become part of his. Ollie's life, once simple and routine, was no longer the same. It wasn't just the shelter that had changed, it was him. Each day, as he walked through the halls of the shelter, his eyes were different, more attuned to the needs of the animals around him. Every bark, every whimper, every glance of distress, he noticed them now. He couldn't ignore them anymore, not after what he had learned through the dog's journey to recovery. The bond between him and the dog had opened his eyes in ways he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't just the dog that had been given a second chance, Ollie had, too. His perspective on life, on responsibility, and on compassion had been completely transformed. No longer was he the worker who just went through the motions, treating animals as tasks to be completed. He was now a caretaker, someone who understood the importance of every animal's life, every soul that crossed through the shelter's doors. But it wasn't easy. The transformation was slow, and there were moments when Ollie doubted himself. Could he truly be the person he had come to believe he could be? Could he live up to the responsibility of caring for the animals, of noticing the cries for help that were so easy to miss before? It wasn't until one particularly difficult day that Ollie realized how far he had come. It had been a rough week. The shelter was filled with animals who needed attention, sick dogs, injured cats, and a host of other creatures that had been abandoned by their previous owners. It was overwhelming, and Ollie felt the pressure mounting. He had been trying to give more of himself to the shelter, but sometimes, it felt like it wasn't enough. The animals kept coming, the problems kept piling up, and Ollie wondered if he was capable of handling it all. That afternoon, a small cat was brought in, its leg badly broken and in desperate need of care. The cat was frightened, trembling, and in too much pain to resist. Ollie had just finished cleaning up after another animal when the new arrival was wheeled in. The cat's cry was soft but filled with the same desperation that he had once ignored in the dog. For a moment, Ollie froze. The old habit threatened to return, the urge to push the problem aside, to tell himself that there was too much to do, that someone else could handle it. But this time, something was different. This time, Ollie didn't hesitate. He rushed over to the cat, kneeling beside it, and gently began to assess the injury. The sight of the broken leg made his heart ache, but he didn't shy away from it. He focused, doing what was necessary to calm the animal, to stop the bleeding, and to make sure it would get the medical attention it needed. As he worked, he thought about the dog. The small, scruffy dog that had once been lost in pain and fear. He remembered the way it had looked at him when he first started to care for it. The way it had trusted him, even when it had no reason to. And now, as he worked with the injured cat, he realized that the dog's healing had not only saved it, but had saved him, too. Ollie had transformed from a worker who turned a blind eye to the suffering around him, to someone who actively sought to make things better. And with that transformation, he found his own purpose. It wasn't always easy. There were days when he felt exhausted, when the weight of the responsibility seemed too much to bear. But every time he saw an animal recover, every time he witnessed the bond between himself and one of his charges deepen, Ollie knew that it was worth it. The workers around him began to notice the change. Lara, who had once dismissed the dog's cries, now worked beside Ollie, her actions more thoughtful, more deliberate. She, too, was learning the importance of truly caring, of seeing beyond the surface and understanding the deeper needs of the animals in their care. Ollie had learned that no matter how busy or overwhelmed he felt, it was never too much to care. There was always room for kindness, always room for compassion, and it was that compassion that made all the difference. One evening, as Ollie sat beside the dog's bed, watching it sleep peacefully, he reflected on the long road they had both traveled. The dog, once broken and suffering, was now healthy, strong, and full of life. Ollie, too, had healed, his heart had softened, his eyes had opened, and his world had become one where caring for others was the most important thing. He stroked the dog's fur gently, his thoughts filled with gratitude. He had been given a second chance, and so had the dog. Together, they had learned the true meaning of compassion, of responsibility, and of the power of action. As the dog stirred slightly in its sleep, Ollie couldn't help but smile. He had never thought that a small, neglected animal would change his life in such a profound way. But here they were, both of them, stronger and better for the journey they had shared. And that, he realized, was the greatest transformation of all. The shelter, once a place that felt cold and impersonal, had become a home for both the animals and Ollie. It had taken time, but he had come to realize that it wasn't just the animals who needed care, it was the people, too. The animals had a way of teaching the humans who cared for them just as much as they learned from their caretakers. Ollie's transformation wasn't just about learning how to tend to the wounds of the animals. It was about understanding the importance of kindness, of noticing the small details, and of acting when help was needed. His eyes were now open, his heart more attuned to the world around him. He no longer saw the animals as mere tasks or inconveniences. They were lives, fragile, complex, and deserving of attention, compassion, and respect. It had been a year since the small dog had first been brought into the shelter. The dog, who had once been broken and abandoned, was now thriving. It had a home, a family, something it had never known before. Ollie had been part of that healing process, both for the dog and for himself. One morning, as Ollie walked through the shelter, he was met with the sight of the dog, now fully recovered, playing outside with a few other dogs. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The once silent, trembling animal was now joyful and full of life, bounding around with the energy of a puppy. It was as though the dog had shed its past, its pain, and was now embracing a future full of possibilities. Ollie stopped for a moment to watch the dog, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had been part of something extraordinary. He had been the one to take the first steps, to offer that second chance, and now, the dog was living its best life. The bond between them, though subtle, was unbreakable. They had both been given a second chance, and they were both making the most of it. As he watched the dog, a small part of him wished he could go back and undo the mistakes he had made. The moments he had wasted, the cries he had ignored. But the truth was, the past could not be changed. What mattered now was what lay ahead. The dog had found healing, and so had he. And that was enough. Dr. Isabella approached him from behind, breaking him from his thoughts. "He's doing well," she said, nodding toward the dog. "You did good, Ollie." Ollie smiled, the weight of her words settling on him. "We both did." The vet chuckled softly. "I think you've learned more from him than you realize." Ollie nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned so much from this experience. About patience, about healing, and about the power of a second chance. He had learned that redemption wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about recognizing that even the smallest gestures could make a difference. That every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the power to change a life. He looked at the dog one last time, its tail wagging as it chased after a ball. "I guess it's true," Ollie murmured to himself, "sometimes, the ones who need saving the most are the ones who end up saving you." Dr. Isabella smiled and walked off, but Ollie remained standing there, watching the dog. The day was bright, and the air felt lighter than it had in years. It was as if the shelter, the animals, and even Ollie himself had found their place in the world. The dog's story had been one of suffering, of neglect, but ultimately of survival. And through that survival, it had changed not only its own life but the lives of those who had cared for it. Ollie had become a different man, one who would never turn a blind eye again, one who would always be there when someone, or something, needed him. He had learned the importance of listening. Of acting when it mattered most. Of showing up, even when it was difficult. And most importantly, he had learned the true power of compassion, how it could heal, transform, and create bonds that could never be broken. As the dog played in the yard, its joy infectious, Ollie made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to learn, to grow, and to care. He would never forget the lesson the dog had taught him, that a second chance is a gift, and that every life is worth saving. As Ollie stood in the shelter yard, watching the dog run and play with the other animals, a quiet sense of peace washed over him. The transformation he had undergone, both personally and professionally, felt complete. It was a life-changing journey, one that had taught him more than he could have ever anticipated. And as he looked around at the animals he had helped care for, he realized just how deeply they had all impacted his life. The shelter had always been a place of work, of tasks to be checked off, of animals to be cared for, one by one. But now, it had become something more. It had become a place of connection, of healing, of second chances. And for the first time, Ollie truly understood the responsibility he had. It wasn't just about feeding the animals or cleaning their cages, it was about seeing them, understanding them, and offering them the kindness they had long been denied. But it wasn't just the animals who had been given a second chance. Ollie had learned that lesson in the most profound way possible. The guilt that had once weighed him down, the regret that had kept him awake at night, was finally gone. He had made mistakes, yes. He had failed the dog when it had needed help the most. But he had also made it right. And in doing so, he had learned that no mistake was too great to redeem, no failure too large to overcome. He looked at the dog again, its tail wagging furiously as it chased after a toy. There was joy in the dog's every movement, a joy that Ollie now recognized as a result of healing. The dog had not only recovered physically, it had recovered emotionally, and so had he. Their journeys were intertwined, both of them learning how to trust again, how to be vulnerable, how to be open to change. Ollie smiled to himself, his heart full. He had changed, but so had the shelter. The workers who had once overlooked the animals' needs, the ones who had dismissed the cries, were beginning to change, too. They were starting to see the animals for what they truly were, beings deserving of compassion, of understanding, of a chance to heal. And it wasn't just in the shelter. The lesson Ali had learned, about compassion, responsibility, and the power of second chances, was something that extended beyond his work. It was something he carried with him every day, in every interaction, in every moment. He was no longer the man who looked away. He was the one who noticed, who listened, and who acted when help was needed. Ali walked over to the dog, who had now slowed down, tired from its play. He crouched down beside it, gently scratching behind its ears. The dog looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, eyes that had once been filled with fear and pain, but now were filled with love and gratitude. In that moment, Ali realized that this was what life was about. Not just about saving others, but about finding redemption within yourself. About learning from the past and using that knowledge to become a better person. He had learned that a small act of compassion could change everything. That a second chance wasn't just a gift you gave others, it was a gift you gave yourself. As he sat beside the dog, his hand resting gently on its back, Ali knew that the lesson he had learned would stay with him forever. That every life, whether human or animal, deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be cared for. He had learned to never ignore the cries for help, to always look deeper, and to always be there for those who needed him most. The shelter had become a place of healing, not just for the animals, but for Ali too. It had taught him that life wasn't about perfection, it was about the willingness to try again, to make things right, to grow. And in that, he had found peace. He had found purpose. The dog, once abandoned and broken, now had a full life ahead of it. And so did Ali. They had both been given a second chance, one that had changed them, healed them, and made them who they were meant to be. The shelter, their shared journey, had given them the chance to be better, to do better, and to live better. Ali stood up, looking out over the shelter, feeling the weight of his journey fall away. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. But he had learned the most important lesson of all, that compassion, when given freely and without hesitation, had the power to heal, not just others, but yourself. And as the sun set over the shelter, Ali knew that this was only the beginning. The lessons learned, the transformations made, were just the start of a new chapter. A chapter where every cry for help would be answered, and every life, human or animal, would be given the second chance it deserved.